Greetings, and thank you for joining us for another SANS ICS Concept Overview. I'm Don C. Weber of Cutaway Security and a certified SANS instructor. In this video, we are joined by Mike Hoffman of Dragos. Mike has 20 plus years of experience as a controls and automation specialist, and he's given several talks at the SANS ICS Summits, and he also has several papers published in the SANS Reading Room. Mike is here today to introduce us to centralized Windows event logging. He will cover the basic concepts of how Windows event logging is set up and deployed within ICS environments. If you enjoy this video and the topics we cover in the SANS ICS Concept overviews, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment if you have a question about this topic or suggestions for future content. This week on the SANS ICS Concepts video, we have another guest speaker. Joining us is Mike Hoffman. Mike is currently working for Dragos, and he has 20 years experience in the ICS industry as a controls and automation specialist. Mike, thanks for joining us. And why don't you just go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, thanks so much, Don. And kind of like you said before, my experience in the industry, mainly in oil and gas, has been 20 plus years. Really started out in the industry as an instrument electrical technician and worked my way up through controls and automation. And then from there, I got into security and held a global role in the oil and gas position. And then now in Dragos as a principal industrial consultant. Also very involved with SANS, and more than happy to be on this weekly presentation and just sharing about the community about Windows log forwarding. And if I think back on this, a number of years ago in the role that I had, there was a lot of challenges around, how do we get logs out of our environment? So there's a lot of course, information on our hosts and endpoints, but how do you get those out without putting on a agent on those systems, if you will? A lot of for those in the community, well recognized that a lot of the systems, a lot of the vendors, rightfully so, don't really allow a lot of agents running on our systems, and those agents would collect those logs off the device and maybe send them over to a SIM server. And so in IT realms, this isn't really so much of a problem. You can install agents on systems, and again, it's not an issue. When you get into the OT space or the IT space, it definitely becomes an issue. So then it's how do you get that information off of your endpoints and over to a visualization platform like a SIM? One of the ways to do it, and one of the ways that many companies have done it for a number of years in the OT environment, is using WMI, or Windows Event Logging. Now, Windows Windows Management Instrumentation, what it actually does is it goes out, reaches out, and actually pulls the information, queries that endpoint, pulls the information off the endpoint. So every so often, it'll reach out and pull information from that host, collect those logs, and send it back and enrich and populate that SIM environment. The problem with WMI, and those who have used OPC-DA and other ones will note that there's a lot of challenges going across firewalls. You have this polling configuration, and that also consumes a lot of bandwidth. And so I actually, a number of years ago, I wrote when I was at the SANS Technology Institute going through the master's program, I took some time, and part of that research was getting into, looking into this issue. And so there is a paper out there. I'd highly recommend you going out to this link and getting into this a little bit more, because in here I'll actually walk through some of the information that I'll be covering here today. And so in this paper, it actually touches on many of the points that I'll be talking about here. But the whole point of this is really to show you in a little bit more detail on actually how it's configured, on how logging is configured or so forth. But this paper does talk about, go ahead, Don.
Oh yeah, and that's what I was, so definitely we'll include this in the show notes. And this is actually how I was, we got introduced before this, this paper and this, the presentation you did, I believe it was two or 3 years ago now?
I believe it was back in 2019. I think on this other tab, there's actually,
Yes.
It's actually recorded, so people can go and watch this presentation as well.
Absolutely. That's a great presentation. We'll have a link in the show notes for you, Mike.
Awesome. Well, let me swing back though and get back into the actual, getting into Windows Event Forwarding, the topic of this. But really, so again, WMI reaches out from a SIM system or whatever, queries the device. So the problem again, you're pulling, you're using up a lot of bandwidth, you have firewall issues, and so forth. So a long time ago, actually, Windows came out with Windows Event Forwarding. Now, Windows Event Forwarding actually utilizes underlying technology of Windows systems to get the logs from the environment, and it'll actually push or pull. I much prefer a push environment where you're just shoving the information out, but it allows you to set up in your environment to push logs off your systems into what's called a Windows Event Collector. Now, this collector, any Windows device can actually be a collector server. So your little corporate laptop, if you could set it up this way, could be a collector server. It's just a service running on a computer. And then from the collector server, you can go ahead and push those logs using probably a SIM agent at that point, and it can be whatever SIM system you're using. You can tie it in. Most of them have those agents running. And a lot of times these Windows Event Collectors are computers in your environment that aren't part of your DCS system, if you will, or your SCADA system. So this is something that you could add on. This is just a Windows device. You turn it on and you begin to forward the information out. So again, with a non-vendor system, it's a little bit easier to put on these agents. So how does this look then from a conceptual view from how do you actually deploy this? Well, so normally you have a domain controller in your environment. And again, if you don't have a domain controller, you can still use Windows Event Forwarding, but it's a little bit more challenging because you have to use certificates. And that's kind of a little bit outside this talk. But in a domain environment, it works really, really well. So with the domain controller, you can set up group policy objects. And within that group policy object, you establish who your collector server is, how often the events are going to be pushed, and so forth. And again, we'll kind of go over that briefly, just how that group policy object would be set up. But in Windows Event Forwarding, it uses two different protocols. So it's using here HTTP over TCP 5985. Now you may be thinking that's insecure. It's clear text protocol. Well, actually what's going on behind the scenes is Windows is actually using Kerberos to authenticate and to encrypt this package of your logs being pushed from your endpoints out to your collector server. So even though you're using 5985, it's still secure. Now you can also use the HTTPS version, but that version requires certificates. And again, a lot of times that's challenging in our OT environments. So again, what you do is domain controller pushes out a group policy object, which tells the endpoints to push their logs to a certain location, a certain server, and then from that server you can push it on to your SIM. Or you can actually chain multiple different Windows Event Collector servers together out to a SIM server. So if you have a very, very large environment, you may want to have multiple different collector servers in your environment. Those collector servers then forward off their logs to a central collector server, which then forwards that to a SIM. These collectors can have a lot of endpoints, thousands of endpoints going into them. So it's normally not an issue in an OT environment, overloading one collector server.
So are you saying it's not an issue or it is an issue?
It is not an issue. So these collector servers, have the bandwidth. So as long as in the environment, the server has the memory and it has a network bandwidth, it can handle pretty much all of the endpoints that you have. So,
well, one of the things that pops into my mind is that a lot of people, especially when they're worried about having all of those extra systems out there, is to force a server to do multiple roles. So your domain controller, having your domain controller also be your log collector. I know that's a bad idea, but is it truly a bad idea? Is it a bad idea in your experience?
It truly is, yeah, and especially when you think about troubleshooting this, or if you need to do upgrades on it or whatever, it's always good to, again, that principal least privilege when you're deploying your servers, especially like a collector server, and with a lot of people now have highly virtualized environments or even pockets of virtualization. This can easily be a virtualized system. It doesn't make sense from a security standpoint and just from an availability standpoint of putting that WEC service on a different server. Have it be its own system. And again, that way it's easier to troubleshoot and all those things. Great question.
Thank you.
So if we go into and actually kind of look at this, what it would look at in a normal OT deployment, Again, sometimes when I've gone into environments, you'll see systems where you have one domain controller throughout your whole OT environment, from your Purdue level 3 down to 2 and 1. And so that works really well, where you have multiple domain controllers, like in here, maybe this security zone has its own domain and there's no trusts. You'd have to actually put a domain controller or use that WEX server down here, and then all your forwarding and that kind of stuff would go to one WEX server, and then you'd have to do that certificate-based authentication from that one WEX server to the other WEX server. But when you're in just the one domain, kind of highlighted on these blue arrows, I apologize, it's getting a little busy in this diagram here, but in one domain, it makes it very easy, where you can push out that group policy object, all systems forward up to that one system, and then that WEX server then can forward out to maybe an OT SIM, and then that OT SIM can forward out to an ITOT SIM in the enterprise zone. So again, there's multiple deployment patterns on how you can use these, but in the end of the day, it allows you to just get those logs, the ones that have been identified, get them into those centralized collection points and push them out to the SIM where they actually need to go. Now, in this little environment, how I'm actually doing this, and this is kind of a busy little drawing here, but I'm actually using an Intel NUC on my little test lab in my home to generate this. But I've done the same deployment using, at multiple sites in my experience, and then I also did it at a lab, a processing lab, where we had over 50 some machines, and that's actually outlined in my paper. Now in this, though, just for a proof of concept, though, just showing that I have, I've got a little Intel NUC, I've got 5 machines running, and I have a domain controller. And so again, I'm using in that domain controller, I'm pushing out a group policy object, and that group policy object is, of course, going to hit every endpoint every 90 or so minutes, depending upon that replication phase. And then once those endpoints hit or they get that new group policy, they all automatically begin to forward their logs into my collector once I've stood up that service. So I'm going to move over and kind of quickly go into my Intel NUC. In my Intel NUC, you can kind of see that I'm using, again, I've got 5 little VMs running. And again, you can do this in your own system. So this is easy to test and deploy. And definitely this kind of technology, always recommend that you deploy small, even in your plant environments. Deploy small and deploy to your less critical systems. And then once you've got all the kinks worked out with the settings and so forth, then you can begin to deploy maybe to your Purdue level 3. And then from there, focus deployments down and down and down until you get complete coverage. Now I'm going to go over to my domain controller on that tab. Of course, it's logged me out. Let me log myself back in. So in my domain controller, what I've done is I've set up a couple of group policy objects. Now, again, to get to group policy, on most domain controllers, you can, at least in the new ones, you can go into Server Manager Dashboard, go in your tools, and go down to your group policy management. Once you're in there, you can create the group policies. Now, the group policy on this is kind of interesting. There's one particular area where you kind of have to look at. And again, what I was wanting to do in this presentation is actually deploy the group policy, go to each endpoint and pull, tell the endpoints to grab the new group policy and actually spin everything up live. But it does take a while to deploy these settings. It takes a while to kind of work out some of the bugs. But with a deployed or with the group policy built and deployed, in about, again, you can manually pull those in, but it takes about an hour for everything kind of to settle in and start for the logs to start showing up in the collector. But here I wanted to show that in the computer configuration particularly, you have an area where you need to tell. So in Windows, you have an event log group. And in that event log group, it allows different processes to access the event logs. And so within that group, you actually need to tell the network service, and that's here, the network service needs to have access to the event log readers in order to pull those logs, in order for that service to grab those logs, and then the Windows event service can then push those along. So by doing this, it allows a network service to access the all event logs. And then from there, you can go into and set up, of course, I've set up a couple firewall rules for Windows remote management. And this is, I think, another interesting piece is that with every security tool that you do or you deploy in your system, you always have to think about how can an adversary use this against me? And again, Windows Remote Management is one of those tools that it's wonderful to use, wonderful to deploy from both an from an administrative standpoint, and it also is used here for pushing the logs. But you also have to think about locking down those settings as well. Windows RM is a very good tool for an adversary to use to pivot down in your environment, to move laterally and vertically and so forth. So definitely, as you're deploying these, always think about how could an adversary use this, and try to lock it down as much as possible. So here, setting up an inbound rule on the local host firewalls to allow WinRM. And I'm actually restricting that down to only 2 systems in the environment to actually can access that service. So on the firewall rule, I'm restricting access, and then there's a couple other locations you can restrict access as well.
So that's all a part of the GPO template?
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
That is all in the template. So you can push out the firewall rule, you can push out who the collector server is and so forth right in the GPO.
Excellent.
Now, go ahead.
And so did you start this yourself? Did you develop this yourself? Did you start with a template or GPO settings that came from Microsoft or from the Center for Internet Security? How did you start? And are you providing this as a part of your paper?
Yeah, so my paper, and that's a great point, my paper actually has a template already in. So just by going to the paper, you can look at it, go down and use that. And the paper, I use a little bit different setting for the security of that event log readers. And there's multiple ways to do this. One, you can lock down your event log so that only that the network, the SID or the security identifier for that service can only access the security log. And so in my paper, I talk about restricting it to that much. Here, the network service can access all event logs, which gives you some more optionality. But nevertheless, where I started with this was, yes, Australian cyber security agency had some good information on that. Some other areas, Microsoft, of course, and there's and again, on the IT space, Windows Event Forwarding is used all over. So there's a lot of good articles out there on how to properly configure and also secure this deployment.
Thank you.
So again, you'll notice again, this is using that 5985 port or TCP. So this is kind of one of the magical strings that you put in. And so here you're identifying the target subscription server. So you're telling every endpoint that gets this group policy object where to send its logs to. And so this is actually targeting a Windows name, host name in my domain over 5985. And then I'm actually saying refresh or go out and check and see if there's a new type of a subscription every 60 seconds. In your environment, you don't need to do this as much. For a test environment, it's nice to always check so you can make changes and see them fairly quickly. But nevertheless, this is how those endpoints know where to send their logs to, is through this string right here. As I go down, again, just limiting again on the remote management service. Here, once again, I'm limiting the number of computers that connect into it. So you can limit connectivity via this setting here, or even the Windows firewall. And then on this section of the group policy, I'm turning on the Windows service. So as all the systems who receive this, once they're rebooted, the WinRM service will automatically start. And then again, that allows those logs to be pushed. Now you can also manually go through. You can script this out with PowerShell. You can manually go through each system. There's a command that you type in WinRM quick config, which will automatically start it up, and then you can use a group policy to then lock it down. Because the WinRM quick config will open that service up to allow it to listen to all connections, and that's not exactly what we want to do. Nevertheless, is a good way of starting it. Now with this group policy here deployed out, and again, I'm just kind of deploying it at the top level in the domain. A lot of times what you'll want to do is maybe when you're starting out, you'll want to have a smaller organizational unit to deploy this to. And in that smaller organizational unit, you may have just a couple of machines, and you can target those machines, make sure everything's working right, and then you can again expand out who that policy is being deployed to.
Would you recommend that? I mean, because there's so many potential Windows systems within the level 3, and so we have our servers, we have our engineer and operator workstations, HMIs. Sometimes HMIs will be on the domain, sometimes they won't. So if you were doing a small rollout, that initial baby step, what would you recommend?
I would definitely be targeting those systems that are not for production. So a lot of the workstations, or the temporary engineering stations and those kind of things, those can be rebooted at any time. It's not a terrible thing. If they're if you take them offline or something like that, this won't do that. But nevertheless, always target those systems that are least critical in your environment and that will not have any operational impact. So that's always those are my test. That's my test bed, essentially.
Does it make a difference if they're connected to the domain? Is it harder to get logs from systems that are not connected to the domain and you've set up by themselves?
Yeah. So if you're working with systems in a work group, like I said before, you actually have to use certificate-based
Okay, that's right.
authentication, and you can script that out. It's a PowerShell script that you can run, but again, you're having to generate your own certificates and so forth. So it's once again, if you're in a work group setting, event forwarding can be used, but it's much more difficult. So great question. So as I move over to the next computer here, and again, it's locked me out. So let me get in.
You're using good security, Mike. Well done.
Absolutely. So what I've got going on here, and also all the events in the environment are actually coming into this forward events section. Once this loads here, there it goes. So if you've ever opened up Windows Event Viewer and looked at this forward events tab, it's probably empty on your end. This is the area where the events will land, coming from all those remote hosts. Now, so that's where those land. And again, if you ever put on a client or an agent moving to a SIMS type system, that agent will come in here and collect the logs out of forward events and push them on. But for our standpoint of view, all we're doing is we're getting the event logs from our endpoints coming into this collector server, and all those logs are being stored here in the forward events.
So it's not, while you might be able to search on specific systems, it's not going to bucketize those without some additional configuration?
Yeah, so it will. So you can see in here, and let's see if we can see some of the hosts.
There we go. Yep.
Yeah. So you're seeing the different computers coming in. So I've got my brew server 2. I've got a domain controller in here and that kind of stuff. So you can see all the events coming in, identified by the computer and all those kind of things. So it's already parsed out and ready to be shipped over to somewhere else. But just getting the events in here, although good to get them collectively, this is not the visualization tool that you want to use to searching for your events. So, right. So there's the location for the events, and then how that actually happens is in this subscription. So here in the subscription, I'll just open it up here real quick. So what I've created is a subscription, and the destination log is forwarded events. That's by default. Now you can create your own different log entries for your destination logs, but this is by default. It goes into forward events. And then you have an option here of going collector initiated or source computer initiated. Now, if I said collector initiated, what that actually means is this server would actually be pulling the logs from the endpoint systems and pulling them back. And similar like WMI, but you're using that the 5985 port. So better, but still you don't want to be pulling devices if you can get around it. So that's why you select source computer initiated. And then when you collect that, you can actually go over here and specify what systems. Now, an easy catch-all is to actually say, I want to collect all of my domain computers, and I want to collect all of my domain controllers. So by these two settings, and you can actually get everything in your environment. So you may not want to do this. You may be a little bit more granular. You may want to, set up a subscription for a couple different servers or whatever, however you want to organize that. But this is a very easy way. With 2 clicks, with 2 groups, you're capturing all of your systems in that domain. And then over here, you can go over to select events. Now, what I've got right now is I'm doing it by log. And over here, you have event logs. And of course, you can select what kind of events. So I'm going through with security logs I've selected, and you can do Windows PowerShell. And so by setting these two, you're getting everything from all those endpoint systems from security, and I'm also collecting all the Windows PowerShell logs.
So
Go ahead.
And as soon as you brought this up, I started thinking about log analysis. But this isn't log analysis. This is actually what it's collecting, what you're setting up to collect for that system to forward on to the collector, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so those endpoints are actually reaching out, and they'll reach out every 60 seconds by that string that I put in from the group policy object. They'll reach out to this collector. They'll look at this subscription, and then they'll say, okay, you want me to send you the security logs and my PowerShell logs, and that's all it'll send over.
Click on the plus next to Microsoft, please.
Yeah.
And then Windows, scroll down to Terminal Services. All right, scroll down just a little bit more. And go ahead and select those.
Oh, the terminal services?
Yes, because you want those logs. Probably not all of them, but well, actually, I mean, yeah, absolutely. You want to know what's going on in terminal services. I would say that that's some critical events that you want to ensure that you're getting.
Awesome. So once I close this, in 60 seconds, those computers in the environment should read those new settings that they want to be pushed over, and hopefully, and it may work, it may not. Online editing and that kind of stuff is always interesting over a presentation. Nevertheless, we should be seeing those. There's also one tab over here on minimize latency. So normally you would want, in an OT environment, you'd want to back this off. So again, this is for a test scenario. I've got minimized latency, which means it's really chatty, and it's going to send me logs very often. What you'd normally do is want to save normal or minimize bandwidth. And so that's just how frequent the computer systems will connect this subscription server and so forth. So there's various settings here. So I'd say either normal or minimize bandwidth is definitely what I do. And so that's the subscription. Now, again, you can add another subscription. I won't do that here, but in a couple of seconds, again, due to my subscription setting, those new logs will be coming over. And one thing I want to show is if I pull up Wireshark, you can kind of see the traffic that's coming through. What I wanted to show here, though, is 162 or 192.168.041 is my collector server. And so if I get into Wireshark a little bit more, you'll be able to kind of see some of the information here a little bit more. And of course, it's using that HTTP. You can see the client. You can see where the host is sending to is through my collector host, and it's also using Kerberos authentication and encryption. So again, even though it's HTTP protocol, it's being encrypted underneath. And that about wraps it up, unless we want to check and wait for a minute or two to see if our
new terminal services
other logs come over. Yep.
No, we don't. We don't need to do that. So you're on here, and you've shown how to configure this. Since this is the collection server, you could actually go into PowerShell and probably leverage some of the and actually I think it might be Blue. I'm trying to remember. It's on the. I had the name for the project, but there are definitely some PowerShell scripts out there. I know some of the SANS team has put out some excellent query scripts and so forth. But since this is the log collector, should be able to open up PowerShell and kind of do some quick queries, some pull out some interesting events, look for anomalous activity that should be investigated and so forth. So is that true? Is that something that you might want to do here?
Absolutely. That's a great point. So once these logs are here, they're sitting in the forward events log. So any other PowerShell scripts you have to go through and look at, maybe you're doing long tail analysis on these logs, or looking at, doing frequency statistics and those kind of things. All those scripts that you're using maybe against these other security or application, you can use those same for your forwarded events. Again, because normally the amount of logs that's coming into the environment, this log is normally will be getting overwritten fairly frequently. So this isn't a good long-term storage. Again, this is a wide spot in your log forwarding regime, getting it onto your SIM, where your SIM is actually your longer-term storage. But you still have the ability to do a lot of those same queries and those kind of things right off of this platform.
Well, I come from an older school for event log management. I do believe that you need to have long-term storage of the actual event. Forwarding it onto a SIM is good for the indexing of information, the correlation of a lot of other log sources as well. But I do like to keep the raw logs. I do like to keep those and periodically rotate those off so that you have them in storage. You can call them up just in case something goes wrong with that SIM. You can rebuild things. But also, I like to look at the raw logs just because there's so many things that I can do that might not be, you may not be able to do when you're talking about the SIM searching and so forth. So I do like to keep the raw logs around, but that takes planning as well. One of the things that came into my mind, we talked about how we want to start with some systems that aren't necessarily critical to production for our testing. But when we're ready, when we're comfortable, when we want to implement it, my personal thought is that we probably want to start with that domain controller because it has DNS, and DNS is extremely important in these environments, especially when a Windows domain is implemented. So is that your recommendation for some of the first critical servers to start collecting from, or do you have another recommendation?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so when you think about it, your domain controller is getting all that log in, log off type activity. It's collecting. It's already that centralized, if you will, that log source. So from that aspect, definitely your domain controllers is the first one I go to. Also, look at your jump boxes for remote desktop connection, your terminal services, kind of like you pointed out here. And then from there, you can even a lot of the systems in the OT environment are redundant. So pick the A or the B server of your DCS or of your SCADA system, and you can do a focused deployment on half of the environment, and again the other half. But as you're talking about is, you look at those systems that are being used, for that have far reach into your environment. Domain controllers certainly do. Any of your management systems, network management, and monitoring systems, and those kind of things are great other sources too to deploy at, which are fairly a little bit lower on the criticality list.
And then my last question is. And this might be a topic for the next one, but have you deployed Sysmon within your test environment to get some more robust logging?
That's a great point. So here, what we're doing on that domain controller, I set up the local policy and an advanced policy for the to capture the logs that I wanted to, and honestly, I've got it turned up fairly high to just ingest a lot of logs for this example. What I'd recommend is actually using Sysmon. So Sysmon is a wonderful tool to do a little bit more fine-grained detail. It allows you, with the right configuration templates and those kind of things, to really capture that traffic, especially when we think about PowerShell and what a lot of the adversaries use for in-memory exploits and those kind of things. Sysmon is a great tool to capture that. And again, when we think about where Sysmon is a signed Microsoft product, So it integrates very nicely into our systems. Again, being very careful, of course, to test out Sysmon deployment and so forth. But you can absolutely use Sysmon to generate those events and then use Windows Event Forwarding, like we've described here, to move those events across the environment and then get those pushed out into a SIM.
Well, I look forward to you tackling that topic in another video.
Awesome.
And before you leave, before we finish up, is there anything, any last minute things you want to tell us about this, about yourself, anything?
Well, one last thing that I wanted to bring up is so in here, we've talked about Windows Event Management or Windows Remote Management, those kind of things. With that, Windows Remote Management uses PowerShell. And so definitely wanted to bring up a little bit about, PowerShell, what version are you running? And so certainly, one of the things that I did in a previous role and others and recommend is that you're using a PowerShell, the latest version. And so you can download that, the Windows Management Framework 5.1. What this will allow you to do is this latest version of the management framework will allow, so we talked about, capturing and logging PowerShell. It does that fine-grained logging, monitors transactions and those kind of things. So as you're thinking about deploying in your environment, or as you're even thinking about PowerShell in general, make sure your systems are upgraded with the latest version. This normally doesn't come out on your normal patching cycle or your patches. So this is something that you'll have to do a little bit of an inspection in your environments and actually deploy this out. But once again, I highly recommend it just for that advanced PowerShell logging, if nothing else.
It's so important. It's one of the things that I put into the chap script.
Absolutely.
I actually did do a video. It's not out at this moment as we're recording, but it should be out in the next couple of weeks prior to this. So I definitely put the checks in there for PowerShell to understand the version that's in the environment. Hopefully it's up to date with 5 or 6, whichever is the latest version. And hopefully you're also going back and removing version 2 as well. So, yes. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on board and helping us understand this topic. And I hope you have a great day.
All right. Thanks so much, John.
All right. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to another concept overview with the SANS ICS and Cutaway security teams. Please let us know if there are other topics you would like us to cover in the comments below. If you enjoyed the content, please be sure to like and subscribe to the SANS ICS YouTube channel. This has been Don C. Weber of Cutaway Security. Go forth and do good things.